Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If you've been following along with episode 1 to 6, you should have enough Blender knowledge to model, create, sculpt 99% of shapes in the real world. As long as you can imagine it, you can create it. With this challenge, we're making a hand holding an apple on a fancy pedestal that you design, or a regular pedestal for that matter. There's not one way to do things. I just chose one of many ways to do things. Here's my thought process while I designed my version of a hand holding an apple with the pedestal. For the pedestal portion, I wanted to borrow the 3-layer structure from a classical pedestal, how there's a wider pedestal on the bottom, there's a slight thinner portion that connects the bottom all the way to the top, and there's a slightly larger platform on the top. This time I decided to start with a sphere and enabled radial symmetry, and I want to make this sphere into a organic 5-star pentagon shape with sort of like a carved wooden type feel. And the tools I used here, draw sharp. I added and subtracted volume from the mesh. And what I did here next is that I duplicated the top and scaled it in object mode. So it serves as a base for the middle portion and the bottom portion of this pedestal. Of course, before sculpting on it, I applied the scale for the middle and the bottom, and used the scrape brush to remove some volume, make some portions of it look slimmer and flatter and smoother. And I thought, why don't we pull out a little portion from the bottom and slot it in the middle? So that was my thought process during this pedestal creation process. Nothing crazy here happened. It's just a combination of draw sharp, adding and subtracting with the same draw sharp brush, a little bit of move, a little bit of snake hook towards the end, and a little bit of transforming it in object mode so it fits the final aesthetic. And that's what I ended up with. Here's a quick little review on the mask extract function that I showed earlier. I created this stem using the mask extract after selecting a portion of the top pedestal. After separating it into a new object, I went into edit mode and extruded all the faces along the normals. I went back to sculpt mode, remeshed, and used a snake hook brush to manipulate this cylinder into a twisty vine type of shape. And that's how I ended up with this. In this portion, after duplicating the stem, I entered sculpt mode to remesh into a lower resolution so it's easier to manage. And I inflated this whole area and pulling this apart so it looks like the palm of a hand. To create the thumb, I duplicated the palm, scaled it horizontally so it's slimmer, then I duplicated it and merged it together and sculpted on it just a little bit to make it look like a thumb. Next, I centered the 3D cursor to the base of the thumb to indicate where that joint is, so I can later on center the origin to the 3D cursor. It's marking the joint of the thumb as a pivot point. I duplicated the thumb to make the middle finger, or one of the fingers. Then after a bit of clay strips, a bit of move, and some sculpting magic, we have our middle finger. Once I redefined the details on this finger, I decided to use mask slice to new object to separate the finger into 3 separate segments. My idea here is once I separate them into segments, I can reorient the origin point so they're easier to pivot and they're easier to move. They're easier to pose later on. So this is quite repetitive right now. We basically select the portion of the segment to orient the 3D cursor to, and then orient the origin to the 3D cursor. And now we have the illusion of a working joint, as you can see here. What I did next is I parented the top segment to the bottom segment and the bottom segment to the main segment, and I parented the last segment to the palm. So now if you move the palm, it'll move all 3 since you have a hierarchy of parenting. After verifying the hierarchy of parenting is correct, I simply just duplicated this finger, scaled it down to make the index finger, repositioned it a little bit. After a little bit of posing, a little bit of moving, a little bit of scaling, and a little bit of finagling, I duplicated the middle finger again to make the ring finger. I held my hand out in front of me, and I imagined holding something really fragile. I'm using just enough strength to keep it in the palm of my hand, and notice the gesture of your pinky and your ring finger curve so much more than your index and your middle finger. Your index finger is almost not involved in this holding motion. After taking the apple and moving it into the palm of the hand, I wanted to capture the essence of gently hugging an object with the palm of your hand. So the thumb, your ring finger, and your pinky are doing most of the work while you're resting the middle finger on top of the apple, while the index finger is almost hovering above it. That's what I was trying to get across. At this moment, we pretty much hit a milestone. So I like to make a backup and create a new collection called backups and hide that collection. Because we're about to merge everything into one, we first join everything together in object mode with Ctrl J, then go into sculpt mode and remesh. And I like to close the gaps by via inflate and smooth and remesh. Just those three operations back to back. The joints do look like they're inflamed, but that won't be an issue for long since I'm going back and I'm redefining the shape of the joints, removing volume where I see fit, changing the shape of each finger. And I'm sort of looking at my own hand in that position and removing a lot of exaggerated form. The tools here that I used are the smooth brush by holding down shift, the clay strips, adding and subtracting by holding down control and letting go of control. And that's pretty much it. So at this portion, we reached the main event of sculpting. Since we already finished our blockouts, it's pretty much time to go back and forth between adding volume and subtracting volume. I am removing volume that looks incorrect, and I'm adding detail in places that needs more detail. And it usually is the most meditative and most enjoyable part of making a digital sculpture. This is the time you put on some music and look at your references and treat it like you're working on a painting study or a charcoal study and enjoy the process. It was sort of at this moment we reached a point where we need to examine the proportions of our sculpture. And it's very common that we will make a mistake in terms of anatomy or proportion or whatever it is that just doesn't look right. So what I did is that I separated an extra piece of mesh between the palm and the thumb. It just looks like it doesn't belong there. Once I removed that little portion, I masked off a portion of the main area of the palm and sort of manipulated in a way where it will connect with the thumb. And I also moved the thumb down in the process in sculpture mode. So now you have a hand that looks more like a hand rather than a hand with an extra joint. So the last and final stretch of our sculpture project was very simple and straightforward. I looked at my own hand, added a few creases that was there. I remeshed the hand into a slightly higher resolution to add a few more details on the fingertips. I readjusted one of the fingers with masking and posing, and readjusted the shapes of the fingertips accordingly. Once I placed the apple back into the hand, I realized we need to adjust the position of the fingers again. You may not need to mask and pose every single time. In a pinch, you can get by with just a move brush or a snake hook brush and make corrections accordingly. The philosophy of building 3D maquettes is pretty much the idea of doing 20% of the work that yields 80% of the results. Nothing has to be precise and perfect, but it needs to convey intention and it needs to convey an accurate form. Next video, we'll talk about materials. Stay tuned.